Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Smith, and this is 5.1 measurement. We're just going to review how to multiply by base 10, which will come into play whenever we're dealing with the metric system, and skip counting, which will come into play whenever we're dealing with the imperial system. So solve without using a calculator. 14 times 1. If you said 14 times 1 is 14, you are correct. 14 times 10, remember whenever you multiply by 10, you just add a 0 to the end, so it should be 140. 14 times 100, if you multiply by 100, you put 2 zeros at the end, so it should be 1,400. There we go. Now, we're going to multiply a decimal, so 0.7 times 1. Well, anything times 1 is just itself. 0.7 times 10, well, if you add a 0 to the end, it doesn't work. What actually happens is you move the decimal over, so 0.7 actually just becomes 7 because the decimal moved from in front of the 7 to behind the 7. And when we do that again, but multiply it by 100, the decimal will move twice, which means we'll have 1 0 behind the 7, so we'll have 70. If you can do these without solving or without using a calculator, great. If you can't, don't worry, you'll be allowed to use a calculator for the rest of this. These are just helpful little tips. If you can do this in your head, you'll get through this quickly. Skip count by 12. Well, to skip count by 12, you just add 12 each time. So you start with 0, 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72. I think that's... Oh, I kept going. 84, 96, 108, and 120. So skip counting is going to be useful whenever we're dealing with feet and inches, because each foot is 12 inches, and we'll learn more about that later. So this will be 1 foot, 2 foot, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way up to 10. Before we get into that, before we get into the measurement, metric measurement. Metric measurement uses the units of millimeter, centimeter, meter, and kilometer. Those are the most common ones you're going to use for this, especially in measuring length. One important thing, or a few important things to know, is 10 millimeters is 1 centimeter, 100 centimeters is 1 meter, and 1,000 meters is 1 kilometer. Next, how long is the red box? Here we have it lined up at the 0, so we don't have to do any subtraction or anything. And it looks like it's 5.5. If I reveal, yes, 5.5 centimeters or 55 millimeters. Remember, there's 10 millimeters in 1 centimeter, so we just multiply 5.5 by 10, and that'll give us 55. Remember, it moves the decimal over 1 if it's a decimal number. Next question, or next page. Match the appropriate measurements with the appropriate units. So I can insert lines here. Okay. Distance between cities. Should that be measured in millimeters, centimeters, meters, or kilometers? Well, distance between cities, you could say meters, but that would be very, very difficult. Usually we use kilometers. What about the height of something? Height. Well, we don't usually measure like your height. You wouldn't measure in millimeters, centimeters maybe, but usually it's in meters. Like on your license plate or license, it should be in meters because we deal with the metric system in Canada. Hair length, millimeters or centimeters? Well, actually we use centimeters normally to measure hair length. Oftentimes anything that's below a meter we'll use centimeters. So hair is not usually beyond 1 meter. And then finally, nuts, bolts, and washers, usually in millimeters if we're using a metric system. So if you're looking for your tools, it should be in millimeters. And there we go. We see everything. The lines are a little bit off because I went all the way to the numbers that we needed to see. Okay, let me just fix that. There, perfect. Next page. Imperial measurement. Imperial measurements use the units feet, inches, yards, and miles. This is where things get a little bit tricky because it's not base 10, so we can't just multiply by 10. So 12 inches is 1 foot. 3 feet is 1 yard. 1,760 yards is 1 mile. So this gets a lot more complicated than the metric system. In addition to that, metric or imperial system uses a lot of fractions. So between 0 inches and 1 inches, we have all these dashes. And the length of the dashes actually signify how large the fraction is, like the base. So the longest is a whole number. So we have 0 and 1 with the longest line. The second longest line is halfway between that. So that's actually 1/2. So 1/2 is right there. And then in between 1/2 and 0, the next longest line is half of that. So half of a half. If you take 1/2 divided by 2, you get 1/4. Right? So that's a quarter of the way between 0 and 1. It's also halfway between 0 and 1/2. The next longest line, and I have it over here because it doesn't really fit nicely on the left side. The next longest line will be half of quarters, so it'll be eighths. And we can actually count out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This should be 5/8. There we go. And you count out every line that's larger than it or the same length. If you do that, you'll get 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 5/8. The next shortest is 16ths because half of an eighth is a 16th. So we got to figure out how many 16ths here. 2 ways to do this. You could count out all the lines going forward. Or, because you know there's 16 between 0 and 1, 16 16ths, you can subtract 1, 2, and 3. If you subtract 3 from 16, you get 13. So that's how we get the 13 over 16. It's 13 16ths here. All right. This is a bit of a learning curve to learn, but once you get the hang of it, it gets a lot easier. And I'm going to have you practice measuring with a imperial ruler, like a measuring tape. If you use a measuring tape before, a lot of construction uses imperial measurements. All right, next slide. How many inches are in 1 foot? Well, we know this, 12. How many inches are in half of a foot? Well, if a whole foot's 12, what's half of 12? If you said 6, you are correct. How many inches is in 2 feet? Well, it'd be double 12, so it'd be 24. How many inches is in 3 feet? Well, it'd be 1 foot plus 2 feet equals 3 feet, so 12 plus 24 gives us 36. Remember what I said about skip counting? That's going to come into play. We have 12, 24, 36. If you can skip count by 12, you can figure this out a lot quicker. Next, we need to match up our measurements here. Distance between cities, well, is that measured in miles, yards, feet, inches? Usually it's miles. If you ever look at an American map, it'll be in miles. Next, let's take a look at length of a room. Yards, feet, or inches. Well, if you ever measured a room, usually it's in feet, so I would match it up with feet. Next, we have hair length. If we were to measure someone's hair length, usually not yards, usually it's in inches. Fun fact, if you were using tools such as socket wrenches, they are in inches as well. for the imperial system. Distance on a football field. The distance on a football field is always measured in yards. All right, that's everything for this lesson. That should be enough for you guys to do the practice. It's mostly just reading a ruler and measuring. If you have any questions about that, make sure you email me and let me know, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. All right, good luck.